Feudalism, the general term used to describe the socio-economic policies and systems of medieval Europe. Where, being alongside the word that I always manage to spell wrong somehow, feudalism is probably the thing to understand when trying to learn about medieval Europe. And yet, when people come to world build their own medieval-inspired fantasy worlds, I find feudalism is often thrown by the side. You still get your general kings and knights and dukes, but the terms seem to be thrown around rather haphazardly, rather than meaning what they at least meant in the historical sense. Now, is there anything wrong with this? No, of course not. It's fantasy, and this channel is not about policing people's fantasies. That sounded weird. This channel is not about policing what people do in their fantasy worlds. Still weird somehow, but that's the version I'm going to use. But for people wanting to try and make a more historical/realistic medieval feudal society in their own fantasy worlds, we're going to discuss what feudalism is, how it works, how it looks, and how it can impact your own fantasy world building. Before we really start off, I do want to quickly say feudalism is a really, really broad word, and people's experience of feudalism varied hugely. The idea that an English peasant from the 9th century had the same sort of life and economic systems as a Polish peasant in the 15th century is very, very wrong. Feudalism is more of a historical term used by historians later to describe the fact, so just bear that in mind. We're going to start with this, the feudal triangle, which is probably what most of you are familiar with when discussing feudalism. And this is a great starting point to understand the structure and hierarchies involved in feudalism. But for this more of a deep dive into feudalism, we're not going to be using this triangle, largely because it doesn't actually work. And for why it doesn't work, we're going to be covering that a bit later on in the video. In this exploration of feudalism, we're going to start at the bottom of society with the fief. Now, the fief was essentially all the common people. These were mostly separated into two different groups, serfs and yeomen. Now, serfs were tied to their lord's estate. This essentially meant that they were under many of the obligations like modern Americans. They were paid in exposure and had no legal rights whatsoever. They could not leave their lord's land without their express permission. This meant they were unable to go out and find other forms of work. Their lord would protect them, offer them food and shelter, and they repaid this in working their lord's land. If you think this sounds a lot like slavery, you're not wrong. The only thing lords couldn't do was buy and sell serfs. On the other end of the peasant spectrum, we have our yeomen. Yeomen were nobility, but they held their own small landed estate. In modern English, this essentially means they rented land from nobles or knights, and they paid rent on this land in money rather than serfs who normally paid it in labour. Whilst many yeomen were simple farmers who would offer their services out to lords for pay, many held skilled trades such as smiths, merchants, and many others. And especially in towns and cities, yeomen commonly joined together in militias and guilds, an early form of organisation that would be used to argue for wages, and in terms of the militia, protect the city. Yeomen would commonly pay to equip themselves in the best armour and weapons they could afford to defend themselves and attack when needed. Using more modern terms, we'd probably describe yeomen as the middle class of a feudal society. During the early medieval, serfs heavily outnumbered yeomen. However, usually, but not always, as you get more and closer to modernity, yeomen start to grow larger and eventually outnumber their serf counterparts. But with the peasants out of the way, let's turn and look at the nobility, starting with the knights. Now, knights fill the roles of essentially landlords. They would live in small manors and would own normally a few hectares of land. They would own a number of serfs who would work their land, and they would rent out other chunks of their land to yeomen in return for profit. And what did knights do with this profit? Well, they would equip themselves with the best arms and armour that they could afford. And in return, the knight would use this arms and armour to protect the people on his land. Did it always work like that? No, of course not. In reality, many knights spend much of their time abroad fighting for profits rather than protecting the people on their own land. And worse, peasants would often get caught in the crossfire between feuding lords. Because serfs were essentially property, attacking and killing serfs was a great way of ruining your opponent's economy. In fact, many knights would purposely maim the serfs of their opponents just so they were unable to work, but the knight would still have to look after them. This, of course, is not to say that all knights were bad to their peasants or were bad to other people's peasants, but this was a common medieval occurrence. But knights were far from the top of the pecking order. Above the knights, we have the major nobles. These are the lords and the vassals, the earls, dukes, and barons who ruled over larger pieces of land. The knights owed these lords both military service and taxes, meaning when a duke would go to war, he would summon his knights to fight beside him. And the knights had an obligation to do so. How many knights a lord could pull to their service depended on how large their fief was. Barons might be able to summon a handful of knights to their service, whilst dukes or earls might be able to summon hundreds, if not maybe thousands of knights to their service when needed. This meant nobles were far more than just major landlords and landowners. They were generals in their own right. The amount of power and sway these lords had could be absolutely huge, which is important when we talk about the top of a feudal system, the king. Now, the king was at least nominally in charge of appointing his nobles, meaning in an ideal world, a king would appoint his best friends and closest allies as the major nobles around him. Meaning when the king wanted to raise taxes or potentially go to war, all he would need to do is ask his nobles to do this and they would carry out his orders. And you're probably thinking at this point, this looks a lot like the feudal triangle you said at the beginning doesn't really work. That's because it is. This is the basic understanding of what feudalism is. This very strict hierarchy with a king at the top and peasants at the bottom. But the truth becomes a bit more complicated when you start looking into it that bit more. For starters, kings technically got their authority from God, meaning that there was always a head honcho above them. But this also meant kings could use this divine favour as an excuse for why they were in charge, and granting them ultimate authority. However, this supreme authority was commonly ignored, especially by powerful lords which the king would rely. After all, what actual authority does a king have over a lord who has more land, power, and authority than him? If anything, these powerful lords might often choose who became king rather than the other way round. But this was true on a smaller scale as well. Commonly, merchants or even smiths were wealthier than their feudal landlords, meaning that a merchant potentially had more economic authority over the knights that potentially ruled them. Additionally, kings and nobles would have their own lands. This meant that they would have their own serfs, meaning that a king would also fulfill the obligations of a noble, and nobles would also fulfill the obligations of knights. And kings would also have their own personal knights on their own personal lands, who would have serfs in turn. And where exactly did these fit on the triangle? And then you get the problem of many knights didn't actually own their own land. Because, well, if a knight has 5 kids, the first 3 are going to get chunks of their own land. The last couple probably aren't going to be so lucky. And so are these landless knights still considered knights? Well, they consider themselves to be knights, but they're no longer part of the feudal system. And none of this is to mention the clergy or the priests who fulfill their own complicated feudal triangle that work besides and within the feudal system. And women. Where do women fit on the scale? Medieval Europe wasn't the best time for female rights, but Does a female noble outrank a male yeoman? Yes, of course they do, but how does this work on the system? Where's that cutoff? And all of this is to say that the feudalism is complicated, but that's okay. Because medieval people had these questions. Medieval people didn't have this great understanding of their own system. What I'm saying is that this is messy. But you should take that and run with it. Feudalism is this really messy general term used by historians hundreds of years after the fact to describe something that was too complicated for the people of the time to understand. What I'm saying is to make things messy, to not make things clear cut, to not have these very strict hard rules in place because they will be broken time and time again. Understanding feudalism is a great first step to making your own fantasy worlds. But then go one step further and think about the exceptions to the rules. Think about those messy borders, and you will create a far more realistic world than just following this exact formula. Because real worlds don't work like that. So we're already at the 10-minute mark, and I don't want to make another really long video. So I think I'm going to end this for now, and the next video I release is going to be how to implement feudalism in your own fantasy world building, how it can impact everything, and exactly what a fantasy feudal system might look like. So make sure you're subscribed and keep an eye out for that video to help you with your fantasy world building. But for now, I'm Bearded Halfling, and thank you for listening.